For nearly 30 years, one man controlled every illegal dollar that moved through New England. He worked from a small vending machine shop on a narrow street in Providence. But his word was the law from Boston to Canada. He never yelled, rarely made threats, and always avoided attention. Yet, everyone from small-time bookies to rich businessmen knew his name and feared his quiet power. This is the story of Raymond Patriarca, a man the FBI called the most powerful gangster north of New York City. A man who built a crime empire so careful and so disciplined that it lasted longer than most real companies. A man who proved that, in the criminal world, silence is stronger than violence. Before we begin this amazing true crime story, I want to hear from you. Where are you watching from, and what time is it right now? Leave your location in the comments below. If you love deep documentaries about gangsters that you can fall asleep to or watch for hours, hit subscribe and ring the bell. If you enjoy this story, give it a like and share it with other true crime fans. Now let's go back to 1902, where our story starts on the docks of Providence, Rhode Island. Waves of Italian immigrants stepped onto American soil, carrying nothing but hope and determination. To understand Raymond Patriarca, you must first understand the world that made him. At the start of the 20th century, America's cities were changing. Providence, Rhode Island, once a quiet colonial port, had become an industrial powerhouse. Factories lined the rivers, their smokestacks darkening the sky. The city needed thousands of workers, and they came from across the Atlantic in crowded ship compartments. They were seasick and tired, but filled with dreams of a better life. Among these immigrants were the Patriarcas. Eleuterio Patriarca arrived in America from southern Italy, a sun-baked land of old traditions and deep poverty. He brought his wife and the customs of the old country, a deep distrust of government, a belief that family loyalty comes before everything, and the understanding that in a tough world, you take care of your own. They settled in Federal Hill, Providence's Italian neighborhood. It was a tight group of apartment buildings where the smell of gravy with pork and sausage drifted from windows. Men played cards on the steps while speaking dialects from Naples and Sicily. The bells of Holy Ghost Church marked the rhythm of daily life. It was here, on March 17, 1908, that Raymond Loreto Salvatore Patriarca was born. Federal Hill in the early 1900s was not the trendy restaurant area it is today. It was a ghetto, a place where immigrants stuck together to survive. Isolated by language and discrimination from the rest of America, young Raymond grew up in a world of contrasts. Inside the close Italian community, there was warmth, tradition, and support. Families helped each other, shared food when times were hard, and celebrated weddings and baptisms together. But outside that protective bubble, Italian immigrants faced constant prejudice. They were called cruel names. Newspapers often showed Italians as criminals. Job ads often said, "No Italians need apply." They worked the hardest jobs for the lowest pay. Their labor helped build America's industry, but they were stuck in the poorest neighborhoods. Eleuterio Patriarca worked brutal hours for little pay. Like many Italian immigrants, he took any work he could find, loading cargo on docks, digging ditches, hauling materials at construction sites. It was back-breaking work that aged men quickly and paid barely enough to feed a family. Raymond watched his father come home exhausted every night, his hands rough and scarred, his back bent from years of hard work. He watched his mother stretch every penny, making meals from scraps and mending clothes until they fell apart. He learned a basic lesson that would shape his whole life. Honest hard work kept you poor. But there was another lesson being taught on the streets of Federal Hill. A lesson whispered about and shown by certain men who seemed to live by different rules. In every immigrant community, some people refused to accept the limits placed on them. In Federal Hill, these were the men who ran illegal lottery games, who loaned money at high interest, who sold illegal whiskey even before Prohibition, who settled arguments that couldn't be taken to the police. Young Raymond noticed these men. They dressed better than factory workers. They didn't look defeated like his father did after a 16-hour shift. People treated them with a mix of fear and respect. They had power in a world that gave Italian immigrants very little. The boy was very smart, though he didn't get much formal schooling. He had a strategic mind that could see patterns others missed. He could calculate risk and reward with cold precision. He was also quiet by nature, not shy, but reserved. He watched, he listened, he learned. By his teenage years, Raymond had already made his choice. He began running small errands for local bookmakers. Nothing serious at first, just delivering messages or packages. He proved reliable and, importantly, secretive. In the criminal world, the ability to keep your mouth shut was more valuable than muscles or boasting. Then came January 17, 1920, a date that would change American crime forever. The 18th Amendment took effect, banning the making, selling, and moving of alcoholic drinks across the United States. This law, called the Volstead Act, was supposed to bring moral improvement and social order. Instead, it created the biggest criminal opportunity in American history. Overnight, a product that millions of Americans wanted became illegal, and that meant huge profits for anyone willing to supply it. For young men like Raymond Patriarca, prohibition was a gift from heaven. By the early 1920s, the teenager was already involved in bootlegging. Rhode Island's coastline, with its many coves and inlets, was perfect for rum running. Ships from Canada and the Caribbean would anchor just outside U.S. waters, an area called Rum Row. Smaller boats would ferry the illegal cargo to shore in the dark. Raymond worked his way up in these operations. He was still very young, still learning the business. But he had advantages. He was smart enough to keep detailed mental records of deals. Tough enough to use violence when needed, but smart enough to prefer talking things out. And disciplined enough to avoid the flashy life that attracted police attention. Inevitably, Raymond's criminal activities caught the attention of the police. In 1926, at just 18 years old, he was arrested for bootlegging. He was found guilty and sent to serve time in the Massachusetts State Prison at Charlestown, a grim, fortress-like place that held some of New England's most dangerous criminals. Charlestown Prison was a brutal place built in the 1800s. It was based on the Auburn system of prison discipline. Hard labor during the day, solitary confinement at night, and absolute silence enforced by guards with clubs. The stone walls were thick, the cells were tiny, and violence was a constant threat. For many young men, a stretch in Charlestown would have been crushing, a slide into despair. For Raymond Patriarca, it was graduate school. Behind those walls, he met the men who would shape his future. Charlestown held bootleggers, bank robbers, and organized crime figures from across New England. In the prison yard and in the workshops, Raymond made connections and learned lessons that no regular education could have provided. He learned the importance of organization and ranks. He learned how to read people, how to tell who could be trusted and who couldn't. He learned that reputation was everything. That if you earned respect through skill or fear, you could have power even from behind bars. Most importantly, he made connections to the organized crime networks in Boston and Providence. The Italian criminal world was starting to organize itself more formally. Influenced by the model being developed in New York by Lucky Luciano, Frank Costello, and others. The old-fashioned bosses, the immigrants who clung to old-world traditions, were being replaced by a new generation of American-born or American-raised criminals who understood that the future belonged to those who could organize, adapt, and think strategically. Raymond served his time quietly, causing no trouble, building his network. When he was released, he was no longer just a promising young bootlegger. He was a made member of the Boston mob, connected to what would soon be called La Cosa Nostra, our thing. The late 1920s and early 1930s were important years for Raymond Patriarca. Prohibition was still in effect, and the money from bootlegging was huge. But Raymond was already thinking ahead. He knew prohibition couldn't last forever. And when it ended, the criminals who depended only on bootlegging would be finished. He began diversifying. He got involved in the numbers racket illegal lottery games that were very popular in working-class neighborhoods. A person could bet as little as a penny, picking the 3-digit number. If your number hit, the payoff was 600 to 1, though the real odds were 1,000 to 1, guaranteeing big profits for the operators. He also entered the loan sharking business. Real banks wouldn't loan money to most working-class people, especially immigrants. But neighborhood loan sharks would at interest rates that could reach hundreds of % a year. Miss a payment, and enforcers would visit to make it clear this wasn't okay. Raymond also married during this time. Helen G. Patriarca became his wife, and she would stay married to him until his death, a period of more than 50 years. She gave him children, including a son, Raymond Jr., who would later follow him into the family business. Helen knew what her husband did. It was impossible not to know, but she kept the traditional separation between family life and business. That was expected in that world. By the early 1930s, when Prohibition finally ended with the 21st Amendment in 1933, Raymond Patriarca was in a good position. Many bootleggers found themselves out of work overnight. Their main source of money was gone. But Raymond had already built a mixed portfolio of crimes. The end of Prohibition was barely a bump in the road for him. During this time, Raymond split his time between Providence and Boston. The Boston mob was the main Italian organized crime group in New England, and Raymond kept close ties to its leaders. He served as a kind of link, operating in Providence, but answering to the bosses in Boston. The Boston family was led by powerful figures who controlled gambling, loan sharking, and labor racketeering throughout the city. But Providence, though smaller, had its own opportunities. The city's political culture was famously corrupt, with local politicians often willing to look the other way for the right price. The police department had officers on various criminals' payrolls, and the state's location small, crowded, and between New York and Boston was ideal for all sorts of illegal operations. Raymond began to see Providence not as a smaller territory, but as a possible headquarters. He started building his own crew, recruiting capable men who were loyal to him personally. He built relationships with politicians, policemen, and businessmen. He invested in real businesses that could serve as covers for illegal activities and give him a look of respectability. He also developed his reputation for a particular kind of leadership. Unlike many mob bosses who ruled through fear and casual violence, Raymond was careful. He preferred to solve arguments through talking and compromise. When violence was needed, he used it precisely and on purpose. Never wastefully or in ways that drew unwanted attention. People began to notice that Raymond Patriarca was different from the typical street thug who got lucky. He thought like a businessman, organized like a company executive, and planned for the long term. These qualities would serve him very well in the years to come. When World War II began, it brought huge changes to American society, and the criminal underworld was no exception. Millions of men were drafted into the military, creating worker shortages that opened opportunities for those who stayed. War industries boomed, pumping money into the economy. And in the chaos of wartime, some kinds of illegal activity became easier. Raymond Patriarca was too old and possibly too well known to be drafted. While other men went overseas to fight, he stayed home and expanded his operations. Rationing created black markets for gasoline, meat, sugar, and other controlled goods. Raymond had a piece of many of these operations, working with corrupt officials to get ration stamps and divert goods to the black market. He also began to strengthen his position in the Providence underworld. The mob in Providence had traditionally been under Boston's control, But Raymond was building something that could stand on its own. He had his own crews, his own income, his own political connections. Boston's bosses noticed, and there were tensions. But Raymond was careful never to start an open fight. He paid money up the chain, showed respect to his bosses, but steadily built his independent power base. By the time the war ended in 1945, Raymond Patriarca was one of the most powerful criminals in New England. And he was just getting started. The years after World War II were a golden age for organized crime in America. Returning soldiers wanted to have fun after years of fighting and hardship. The economy boomed, cities grew, and the mob was perfectly placed to provide the entertainment and services that millions of Americans wanted. But the law said they couldn't have. Illegal gambling was the biggest moneymaker. Sports betting, casino-style games, numbers rackets, and card games made billions of dollars every year. Loan sharking flourished, as did labor racketeering, extortion, and various protection schemes. For mob bosses who could organize and control these activities, the profits were enormous. In New England, the criminal scene was split up. Boston had a powerful mob family, but there was constant internal fighting and struggle for leadership. Smaller cities like Providence, Worcester, Hartford, and Springfield had their own local operations. But these were often disorganized and open to interference from outside groups. Raymond Patriarca saw an opportunity. He imagined a united New England crime family with branches in all 6 states, running with the efficiency of a modern company. It was a bold vision, but he had the intelligence, patience, and ruthlessness to make it real. Raymond's headquarters was at 168 Twells Avenue in Federal Hill, the same neighborhood where he'd grown up. The building housed a real business, the National Cigarette Service Company, which ran vending machines throughout Rhode Island. It was the perfect cover. The business made real money, gave a good reason for the constant flow of visitors, and explained why Raymond spent so many hours there each day. But everyone in Providence knew what 168 Twells Avenue really was. The office. The office was where Raymond held court. Every day, a steady stream of visitors would arrive. Bookmakers bringing their weekly payments. Loan sharks reporting on collections. Politicians asking for favors. Businessmen asking permission to operate in various industries. And criminals asking Raymond to settle their arguments. The space was purposely simple. There was no marble or fancy wood, no showy displays of wealth. Just a simple office with a desk, some chairs, and a telephone. Raymond understood that real power doesn't need to show off. His typical day would start in late morning. He was a night person by habit, often staying up late meeting with associates or doing business best done after dark. He'd arrive at the office around 11 or noon, always dressed neatly in a conservative suit and tie. Despite his wealth and power, he avoided flashy jewelry or expensive cars. He wanted to look like a respectable businessman, not a gangster. Throughout the afternoon and evening, he would receive visitors. Each meeting was usually brief, 15 or 20 minutes. Raymond had an amazing memory for details and didn't need to write much down, which was good since written records could be seized by police. He spoke quietly, rarely raising his voice. People had to lean in to hear him, which made his words seem heavier. He was a great listener, letting others talk while he took in information. He asked sharp questions that showed whether someone was telling the truth or hiding something. And when he made a decision, it was final. There was no appeal, no arguing, no second guessing. Raymond couldn't control New England alone. He needed capable helpers, men he could trust with important jobs. He was very careful in choosing his inner circle, valuing loyalty and skill above all else. His underboss was Henry Tamaleo, a smart and sophisticated criminal who served as Raymond's main deputy. Tamaleo was respected throughout the underworld for his fairness and business sense. He managed many of the family's daily operations, freeing Raymond to focus on strategy and the bigger picture. Other key members of the organization included Gerardo Jerry Angelo, who ran the Boston crew and made huge amounts of money through gambling and loan sharking. Angelo was tough and capable, overseeing dozens of bookmakers and enforcers. His operation was so profitable that at its peak it made millions of dollars every year. Raymond also had strong capos in other New England cities, in Hartford, in Springfield, in Worcester. Each city had a crew that answered to Providence. These local operations handled gambling, loan sharking, labor racketeering, and other businesses, all sending money up to Raymond. The structure Raymond created had ranks but was flexible. At the top was Raymond himself, the boss whose word was law. Below him was the underboss and the consigliere, counselor. Then came the capos, each controlling their own crew of soldiers and associates. Information and money flowed up the chain. Orders flowed down. But Raymond also encouraged direct talk when needed. He didn't want a stiff bureaucracy to slow down operations or let his helpers trick him. He held regular meetings with his key people, sometimes gathering them all together, sometimes meeting them one by one. He wanted to hear different views to understand what was really happening on the streets. By the early 1950s, Italian organized crime in America had reached a level of organization that would have been unbelievable a generation earlier. The National Commission, a board of directors made of the bosses of the most powerful families, met from time to time to settle arguments, divide territories, and set rules. Raymond Patriarca earned a seat on the commission. A remarkable achievement, the commission was dominated by the 5 families of New York Bonanno: Colombo, Gambino, Genovese, and Lucchese, along with the Chicago outfit and a few other major organizations. For the boss of New England to have an equal voice showed just how far Raymond had come. He developed especially close relationships with the Genovese family, long considered the most powerful of the New York families. The Genovese family had interests in New England, and Raymond worked out deals that let both organizations profit without conflict. He also kept good relationships with Carlo Gambino, whose family was quickly rising to power in New York. These national connections were crucial. They gave Raymond access to resources, information, and support that a purely regional boss wouldn't have had. They also gave him protection. Anyone thinking of challenging Raymond's position would have to consider that he had powerful friends who might fight back. Raymond attended commission meetings in New York, always arriving quietly and leaving the same way. He didn't seek the spotlight. Unlike some mob bosses who enjoyed attention and fame, Raymond preferred to stay in the shadows. The FBI and police had files on him, of course, but the general public had little idea who he was or what he controlled. By the mid-1950s, the Patriarca crime family controlled illegal gambling throughout New England. The size of these operations was amazing. Numbers games ran in every working-class neighborhood in every city and town. Each day, thousands of people would place their bets with local numbers runners, who would pass the money and betting slips up the chain. The organization had to track all these bets, figure out the winning numbers, pay winners, and collect the profits, all while keeping everything hidden from the police. Sports betting was even more profitable. During football season, baseball season, basketball season, hockey season, whenever there were games, there were people wanting to bet on them. Bookmakers took bets on point spreads, over-unders, parlays, and straight-up wins. The bookies paid Raymond's organization for the right to operate, and they followed strict rules about how to run their business. Casino-style gambling also did well, though it was riskier because it needed physical locations. Still, illegal casinos ran in back rooms of restaurants and clubs, in warehouses, even in private homes. Raymond's organization controlled who could run these games and took a cut of the profits. Loan sharking was another huge moneymaker. The Patriarca family loaned money to people who couldn't get credit through normal channels, gamblers who needed to cover losses, small business owners who needed quick cash, criminals financing their own operations. The interest rates were extremely high, and the collection methods were brutal. But there was never a shortage of customers. Labor racketeering gave both money and power. The Patriarca family had influence in many unions throughout New England, especially in construction, trucking, and dockworker industries. This control let them get payoffs from employers who wanted labor peace, put mob associates in no-show jobs, and skim money from union pension funds. Extortion and protection rackets ran throughout the family's territory. Businesses paid monthly tribute in exchange for protection, which really meant protection from the mob itself. The unspoken threat was clear: pay and you'll have no problems. Don't pay and problems will start. Raymond strongly believed in having real businesses alongside the illegal ones. His vending machine business was truly profitable and provided legal income he could report on tax returns. He also had interests in real estate, restaurants, and other businesses. These real businesses served many purposes. They provided legal income and helped explain the lifestyle Raymond had. They offered jobs for family members and associates who needed regular work. They created chances to launder money. Illegal cash could be mixed with legal money and cleaned. And they gave a respectable front that made it harder for police to prove. Raymond was mainly a criminal. Raymond paid taxes on his legal income. He'd seen too many criminals brought down by tax evasion charges when the government couldn't prove their other crimes. Al Capone's conviction for tax evasion in 1931 had taught the whole underworld a valuable lesson. The IRS was more dangerous than any prosecutor. Raymond ran his organization by a strict code of conduct that every member understood and was expected to follow. Breaking the code could mean severe punishment, including death. Omerta, the code of silence, was most important. No member could cooperate with police under any circumstances. Being called an informant was a death sentence. Even suspicion of talking to police could get you killed. Loyalty to the family came before everything except your own immediate biological family. When Raymond called, you came. When he gave an order, you obeyed without question. When the family needed something, you provided it. Respect for the chain of command was essential. You didn't go around your immediate boss to talk to someone higher up unless specifically invited. You showed proper respect to your bosses. You never challenged Raymond's decisions, at least not publicly. Earning money was crucial. Every member was expected to make money, whether through their own operations or by giving a percentage of what they made to the family. The family was a criminal business, and everyone needed to help it make a profit. Violence had to be approved. You couldn't just kill someone because they made you angry or because it would be convenient. Murders had to be okayed by Raymond himself. Unauthorized killings would be punished, possibly by death. Family members couldn't deal drugs. This was a rule throughout most of the Italian-American mob during this time. Drug trafficking brought too much attention from police, and the punishments were too severe. It wasn't worth the risk to the organization. Members couldn't have affairs with the wives or girlfriends of other members. This rule was about preventing internal fights that could tear the family apart. Raymond ruled through a mix of fear and respect. The fear came from everyone knowing he had the power and willingness to use violence when needed. The respect came from his intelligence, his fairness in settling arguments, and his ability to make everyone prosper. Stories went around about what happened to people who crossed Raymond. A bookmaker who held back money from the family might disappear, his body never found. A businessman who refused to pay tribute might see his business vandalized or burned. A member who showed disrespect might be badly beaten as a lesson, but Raymond wasn't unpredictable with violence. He used it strategically, not emotionally. When he ordered someone killed, there was always a clear reason, and the killing served a purpose: to remove a threat, to punish a betrayal, to send a message. Random violence attracted police attention and created instability. Purposeful violence kept control. The respect Raymond commanded was equally important. He had a reputation for keeping his word. If he made a deal, he honored it. If he promised protection, he gave it. If he said he would settle an argument fairly, both sides knew they would get a fair hearing. He was also known for his intelligence and strategic thinking. When two members of the family had a conflict, Raymond could find solutions neither had considered. When a new opportunity came up, he could see angles and potential problems others missed. People came to depend on his judgment, which made his power even more absolute. By the late 1950s, the Federal Bureau of Investigation was starting to take organized crime more seriously. J. Edgar Hoover, the Bureau's longtime director, had earlier denied that a national crime network even existed, preferring to focus on bank robbers, kidnappers, and political radicals. But the evidence was becoming impossible to ignore. In November 1957, police accidentally found a meeting of mob bosses from across the country at the home of Joseph Barbara in Appalachian, New York. More than 60 high-ranking mafiosi were identified at what became known as the Appalachian Meeting. The discovery made national news and forced Hoover to admit that organized crime was a serious problem. Raymond Patriarca hadn't been at Appalachian. He was too smart to go to such a large, risky gathering. But the FBI now understood there was a national crime network, and they began investigating the major families more aggressively. Agents started compiling files on Raymond and his organization. They watched him, noting who visited the office and when. They tried to recruit informants, though with little success given the mob's code of silence. They looked for ways to build cases that could lead to prosecutions. Raymond knew about the increased attention, but he wasn't too worried. The FBI's tools were limited at this stage. Electronic surveillance was restricted by law and needed warrants that were hard to get. Informants were rare. Prosecutors had trouble proving cases against mob bosses, who kept themselves separate from direct involvement in crimes. Raymond kept operating with confidence. He'd been in the crime business for 30 years by this point, and he'd survived everything the police had thrown at him. He believed he could survive this new pressure. By 1960, Raymond Patriarca controlled organized crime throughout New England with absolute authority. His territory included Rhode Island, Massachusetts, Connecticut, Vermont, New Hampshire, and Maine, 6 states. In many ways, he ruled them more effectively than any elected governor. The size of his empire was breathtaking. The Patriarca crime family had hundreds of made members and associates, making tens of millions of dollars every year through gambling, loan sharking, extortion, and labor racketeering. In today's money, adjusting for inflation, the family's yearly income would be in the hundreds of millions. Every important criminal operation in New England needed Raymond's permission. A bookmaker couldn't operate without paying the family. A loan shark had to give a percentage. A burglar or robber who pulled off a big job had to pay a tax to the family or face severe consequences. Even criminals who weren't formal members of the organization had to acknowledge Raymond's authority, but Raymond's power went far beyond the criminal underworld. He had politicians in his pocket throughout New England. Some were on the payroll directly, getting regular cash payments. Others got campaign contributions or other favors that ensured their loyalty when the family needed a zoning change, a liquor license, or someone released from jail. These politicians made it happen. Law enforcement was also compromised. Not all police officers and agents were corrupt, but enough were that the family always got advance warning of raids and investigations. Wiretap warrants would leak before they could be used. Arrest plans would be shared with the targets. Evidence would disappear from police property rooms. The justice system itself was penetrated. Judges owed their jobs to political machines the mob influenced. Defense lawyers shared information about their clients. Court clerks gave access to sealed documents. Jury members could be bribed or threatened when needed. Raymond had created a shadow government, one that worked in the shadows but had real power over the lives of millions of people in New England. Let's walk through a typical day at the office in the early 1960s. At the peak of Raymond's power, the morning would start quietly. Raymond's home was a modest house in a nice Providence neighborhood. Nothing about it suggested one of America's most powerful criminals lived there. He'd have breakfast with Helen, maybe read the Providence Journal and Boston Globe to stay informed. Then dress carefully in one of his well-made but conservative suits. He'd drive himself to the office in a Cadillac, nice but not showy, and park behind the building. He'd enter through the back door, nodding to the men always stationed there to keep him safe and to screen visitors. Inside, his consigliere or underboss would be waiting with updates from the previous night. Any issues, any money that had come in, any problems needing the boss's attention. Then the parade of visitors would begin. First might come Jerry Angulo from Boston, arriving with a briefcase full of cash the week's take from Boston operations. Angulo would report on business, any problems with competitors or police, any opportunities he'd found. Raymond would listen, ask questions, give instructions. The meeting might last 20 minutes. Next might be a local politician, stopping by to discuss a pending vote in the state legislature. The family wanted certain laws killed or changed. The politician would explain what could be done, what it would take, the risks. Raymond would decide whether to proceed and what resources to commit. A bookmaker might arrive, asking permission to expand his operation into a new area. Raymond would consider the request, thinking about whether it might create conflicts with existing operations, whether the bookmaker had proven trustworthy, whether the area was worth developing. He'd make a decision, and the bookmaker would know it was final. Two family members might come with an argument they couldn't solve themselves. Maybe one felt the other had disrespected him, or there was confusion about who had rights to a particular criminal opportunity. Raymond would hear both sides, ask questions, and make a ruling both would have to accept. A businessman from the construction industry might visit, wanting labor peace on a major project. He'd explain the situation, and Raymond would name a price for making sure there would be no strikes, no vandalism, no problems. The businessman would agree or try to negotiate, but he'd know that refusing to pay would lead to problems costing far more than the payoff. Lunch would be brought in from one of the Federal Hill restaurants, maybe pasta and meatballs, a salad, some bread. Raymond would eat while continuing to meet visitors or discuss family business with his closest advisors. The afternoon would continue the same way, a constant flow of people seeking his permission, his protection, his judgment, or his services. Some brought money, tribute from their operations. Others came with problems they needed solved. Still others wanted his blessing for new ventures. Raymond handled it all with remarkable efficiency. He never seemed rushed, never raised his voice, never looked flustered or unsure. He listened carefully, thought deeply, and made decisions quickly. People left knowing exactly where they stood and what they needed to do. Evening might bring different kinds of meetings. Maybe a representative from one of the New York families would come to discuss business between the organizations. Or Raymond might have dinner with local politicians or businessmen meetings, where criminal business would be talked about in indirect terms that wouldn't be proof if someone was listening. Late at night, after everyone had left, Raymond might sit alone in his office, thinking through the complex web of operations, relationships, and threats he managed every day. He'd think about the long term, trying to see problems before they arose and find opportunities before his competitors did. Then he'd drive home, arriving late, maybe share a drink with Helen before bed, only to start the whole cycle again the next day. In 1963, something happened that would change the landscape of organized crime in America. Joseph Valachi, a soldier in the Genovese crime family, became the first made member of the American Mafia to publicly admit its existence and describe its structure. Valachi's testimony before a Senate committee was shown on TV and reported widely in newspapers. For the first time, average Americans heard about La Cosa Nostra, About the commission, about the initiation rituals and codes of conduct that ruled the mob. Valachi described the structure of the families, the roles of bosses and underbosses and capos. He named names, identifying hundreds of mobsters across the country. He confirmed that organized crime was a national network, not just isolated local gangs. The hearings were a sensation. They also created huge problems for the mob. The veil of secrecy had been lifted. Law enforcement now had a roadmap for how to investigate organized crime. The FBI greatly expanded its efforts against the mafia. Prosecutors started developing new strategies for bringing down mob bosses. Raymond Patriarca watched the Valachi hearings with concern. Valachi hadn't been part of the New England family and didn't have detailed information about the Patriarca organization. But the principle was what mattered. A made member had broken omerta and lived. Valachi was in protective custody, but he was alive. That sent a dangerous message. Raymond tightened security. He became more careful about what he said and where he said it. He reminded his members of the absolute importance of the code of silence. And he began planning for a future where the FBI would be a much tougher enemy. In November 1963, President John F. Kennedy was assassinated in Dallas, Texas. The official investigation said Lee Harvey Oswald acted alone. But almost immediately, other theories began to circulate. Some involved organized crime. The mob certainly had reasons to want Kennedy dead. His brother, Attorney General Robert Kennedy, had made prosecuting organized crime a top priority. RFK had greatly expanded the Justice Department's organized crime section, hired dozens of new prosecutors, and pushed the FBI to focus on the mafia. Prosecutions and convictions of mob figures had skyrocketed under his leadership. Also, some mob bosses believed they had helped elect Kennedy by using their influence in key states like Illinois and West Virginia during the 1960 election, only to be rewarded with aggressive prosecution. They felt betrayed. Carlos Marcello of New Orleans, Santo Trafficante of Tampa, and San Giacomo of Chicago were all mentioned in various theories about mob involvement in the assassination. Some researchers claimed that Jack Ruby, who killed Oswald, had mob connections and was silencing a witness. Raymond Patriarca's name sometimes came up in these theories, too, though usually on the edges. As a commission member and major crime boss, he would have known about any coordinated mob action. Some theorists suggested the mob used its connections to Cuban exiles and intelligence agents to arrange the killing. The truth is that no solid evidence has ever come out to definitely prove mob involvement in the Kennedy assassination. But the theories continued, and they added to the mystery and perceived power of organized crime leaders like Raymond Patriarca. What is clear is that Raymond, like all mob bosses, benefited from Robert Kennedy leaving the Justice Department after JFK's death. President Lyndon Johnson didn't share his predecessor's zeal for targeting the mafia. RFK stayed as Attorney General for several months before leaving to run for Senate. The pressure on organized crime dropped a lot, giving bosses like Raymond some breathing room. During this time, Raymond also had interests in Cuba, though these mostly ended after Fidel Castro's revolution in 1959. Before Castro, Cuba had been a paradise for American organized crime. The mob controlled casinos in Havana, making enormous profits while working with the full cooperation of the corrupt Batista government. Raymond's organization had sent some money and people to Cuba, sharing in the island's casino profits. When Castro took power and kicked out the American mob, those investments were lost. Like many mob bosses, Raymond was angry about this and would have supported any effort to overthrow Castro and bring back a mob-friendly government in Havana. The CIA's attempts to overthrow Castro, including the failed Bay of Pigs invasion in 1961, were well known to mob leaders. There's evidence the CIA actually recruited mob figures for various anti-Castro operations. including alleged plots to kill the Cuban leader. Whether Raymond was directly involved in any of these plans is unclear, but he certainly would have known about them through his commission connections. The Cuba situation was just one example of how Raymond's world touched international politics and spy operations in extraordinary ways. Here was a man who ran gambling and loan sharking, yet who had connections that reached into the highest levels of organized crime, which in turn connected to intelligence agencies and international intrigue. While Raymond preferred to work quietly and avoid unnecessary violence, he was completely ruthless when discipline needed to be enforced or threats needed to be removed. The 1960s saw several high-profile murders and disappearances connected to the Patriarca family. In March 1965, Edward "Teddy" Deegan was murdered in Chelsea, Massachusetts. Deegan was a small-time criminal involved in various robberies. He was tricked into an alley and shot to death. 4 men were eventually convicted of the murder and sentenced to life in prison. What wasn't known at the time was that the FBI had advanced knowledge of the hit through an informant, but didn't warn Deegan or stop it. Even worse, the FBI knew one of the convicted men was innocent, but let him be imprisoned anyway to protect their informant. This would later become a huge scandal that showed deep corruption in the FBI's handling of informants. The Deegan murder, and others like it, showed the iron grip Raymond kept on his territory. People who were threats, who couldn't be trusted, who knew too much, they disappeared. Bodies turned up in car trunks, in shallow graves, weighed down in rivers, or never turned up at all. Raymond kept himself away from direct involvement in these killings through layers of helpers. He might give an order in the most indirect terms: "We have a problem with so-and-so," or "That person needs to go," and his underlings would understand what needed to be done and handle the details. This made it very hard for prosecutors to prove Raymond had ordered specific murders. The violence served many purposes. It removed threats and problems. It enforced discipline within the organization. And it sent messages to anyone thinking of challenging Raymond's authority or cooperating with police. In the brutal logic of the criminal underworld, violence was a necessary management tool. In 1966, a murder happened that would eventually come back to haunt Raymond in ways he couldn't have predicted. Raymond "Baby" Curcio, a mob associate connected to the Patriarca family, was killed in Providence. Curcio had apparently gotten on the wrong side of the organization. Somehow, maybe he'd been stealing money, or talking too much, or just become a liability. The exact details of why he was marked for death are unclear, but the order came down that he needed to be eliminated. Curcio was tricked into a meeting and shot to death. His body was disposed of, and for a while, it seemed like just another mob killing that would never be solved. But police were paying closer attention now. They were developing new techniques, recruiting informants more aggressively, and building more complex cases. Investigators started putting together what had happened to Curcio. They found witnesses and informants who could testify about the murder plot. And crucially, they began building evidence that the order had come from Raymond Patriarca himself. This would take years to develop into a case that could be prosecuted, but the wheels were turning. The Curcio murder would eventually play a key role in bringing down the seemingly untouchable boss of New England. During this time, Raymond was also preparing his son, Raymond Patriarca Jr., to eventually take over. Raymond Jr. had grown up in the mob life, understanding from a young age what his father did and what his own future likely held. Raymond Jr. was formally brought into the family, going through the traditional initiation ceremony. He began taking on responsibilities within the organization, learning the business from the ground up. His father introduced him to key family members and to associates from other organizations, building the connections that would be crucial if he were to eventually take charge. But Raymond Jr. was not his father. He lacked the older Raymond's strategic brilliance, his commanding presence, his ability to see around corners and anticipate problems. This was clear to many in the organization, and it created worries about what would happen when the inevitable handover occurred. Raymond Sr. knew about his son's limits, but hoped time and experience would fix them. He believed in the importance of family, and passing leadership to his son seemed natural and right. But it was a decision that would have consequences later. By the mid-1960s, Raymond's organization touched almost every part of illegal activity in New England. Let's look at just how big the empire had become. In gambling alone, the Patriarca family controlled thousands of bookmakers across the region. During football season, millions of dollars in bets would be placed every week. The bookies paid a percentage to the family for the right to operate, creating a steady stream of income that needed no direct involvement from Raymond or his top lieutenants. The numbers racket was even bigger. In every working-class neighborhood, people placed their daily bets, dreaming of the big win that would solve all their money problems. The Patriarca organization had perfected the logistics of running these operations, collecting bets, figuring out winners, paying jackpots, and taking profits, all while keeping everything hidden from police. Loan sharking had become a sophisticated operation. The family had millions of dollars on the street at any given time. Loans had interest rates that would make even credit card companies blush. Collection was enforced through the threat of violence. Borrowers who couldn't pay might find themselves forced to commit crimes to get money or to hand over assets for pennies on the dollar. Labor racketeering gave the family influence over major industries. Construction projects couldn't go ahead without labor peace, and labor peace cost money. Trucking companies needed to make sure their drivers didn't face problems, and that cost money too. Dock workers could move cargo quickly or slowly, depending on whether the right people had been paid off. The family also took a cut of various real businesses throughout New England. Some of these were covers for illegal activity. Others were truly profitable businesses the mob had forced its way into. Restaurant owners, bar operators, strip club owners, many paid regular tribute to the Patriarca organization for the privilege of operating without problems. And then there were the more unusual rackets. The family had pieces of the pornography business, cigarette smuggling, avoiding state taxes, various frauds and scams, operations for selling stolen goods, and countless other schemes. If it made money illegally in New England, Raymond Patriarca got a share. Despite his enormous wealth and power, Raymond kept a fairly modest lifestyle, at least on the outside. He lived in a nice but not huge home. He drove a Cadillac but not the most expensive model. He dressed well but simply. He didn't wear flashy jewelry or surround himself with obvious displays of wealth. This was partly practical. Showy displays of wealth attracted attention from police and tax authorities. How could you explain a mansion and luxury cars when your reported income was from a vending machine business? But it was also a matter of belief. Raymond came from poverty and never forgot it. He'd seen what happened to criminals who got too caught up in their own image, who spent wildly and lived carelessly. They attracted envy. They made mistakes. They drew attention. Raymond preferred to stay in the shadows. That said, he enjoyed good things within reason. He ate well, going to the best Italian restaurants in Federal Hill, where owners would make special dishes not on the menu. He took vacations, usually to Florida, where he had friends and connections in the mob-influenced casino scene. He had the satisfaction of knowing he could have almost anything he wanted. But more than material wealth, Raymond valued power and respect. He liked that when he spoke, people listened. That when he made decisions, they were carried out without question. That he had built something lasting and important, even if it was a criminal business. By the mid-1960s, the FBI was developing new weapons in its war on organized crime. Electronic surveillance bugs and wiretaps had become more sophisticated and legally easier to use. The FBI began putting listening devices in mob hangouts across the country, and the office in Providence was a prime target. In 1962, FBI agents managed to plant a bug in Raymond's headquarters. The technical details of how they did this are partly secret, but they got a microphone into the office that would send conversations to FBI receivers nearby. For months, FBI agents listened to Raymond doing business. They heard him discussing criminal operations, ordering violence, settling arguments, and managing his empire. The tapes were a treasure of intelligence, showing the inner workings of the Patriarca crime family in never-before-seen detail. However, there was a problem. The bug had been put in without a proper warrant. At that time, the law about electronic surveillance was unclear, and the FBI operated under the idea that national security concerns gave them broad power. But when it came time to use the recordings in court, prosecutors realized they might not be allowed. Still, the FBI kept up its surveillance. They put in more bugs and wiretaps, this time making sure they had proper legal permission. They built a large record of Raymond's criminal activities, slowly putting together cases that could lead to prosecutions. Raymond knew he was being watched and listened to. Informants and corrupt police warned him about the surveillance. He became more careful about what he said and where he said it. He started taking walks outside when discussing sensitive matters or having conversations in cars while driving, hoping to avoid the bugs, but the surveillance kept producing valuable information. The FBI was learning the structure of the organization, the identities of key members, the nature of various criminal operations. They were building a complete picture that would eventually be used to take apart the Patriarca crime family. Running a criminal empire took a huge psychological toll, even on someone as disciplined and controlled as Raymond Patriarca. The stress was constant and came from many directions. There was the threat of prosecution and prison. Every day brought the risk that this would be the day the FBI came with an arrest warrant, that some case they'd been building would finally be ready. There was the threat of violence. Raymond had enemies, rival criminals, people he'd wronged, ambitious helpers who might see him as an obstacle. He had to keep constant security, always aware that any meeting could be an ambush, any meal could be poisoned, any drive could end in bullets. There was the burden of responsibility. Hundreds of people depended on Raymond for their livelihoods. They looked to him to make decisions that would keep money flowing and keep everyone out of prison. The weight of all those expectations was enormous. There was the isolation. Raymond couldn't fully trust anyone except maybe Helen. Every person who smiled at him might be plotting against him. Every friend might be an FBI informant. Every conversation might be recorded. The suspicion built into the criminal life meant that real human connection was almost impossible, and there was the moral weight. Raymond wasn't a psychopath. He understood right and wrong. He knew his organization hurt people, the gambling addicts who destroyed their families, the borrowers crushed by loan shark debt, the victims of violence. He had built his life and wealth on human suffering. And at some level, he had to live with that knowledge. Raymond dealt with these pressures by compartmentalizing and by discipline. He separated his business life from his family life as much as possible. He kept routines and rituals that gave structure to his days. He convinced himself he was providing a service, that gambling and other vices would exist whether he controlled them or not. So he might as well benefit, but the stress was always there, grinding away, taking a toll on his health and his peace of mind. In 1968, the collected evidence from FBI surveillance and informant testimony finally produced results. Raymond Patriarca was charged with conspiracy to commit murder in connection with the Raymond baby Corcio killing 2 years earlier. The prosecution's case was built on testimony from several witnesses who said Raymond had ordered the hit. They described meetings where the murder was discussed and planned. They placed Raymond at the center of the plot, making decisions about who would carry out the killing and how. Raymond's defense team argued the witnesses were unreliable criminals trying to reduce their own sentences by testifying against him. They attacked the credibility of the prosecution's case and tried to show their was no physical evidence directly linking Raymond to the murder. But the testimony was convincing, and the prosecution did a skillful job of supporting the witnesses' accounts with other evidence. In 1968, Raymond Patriarca was convicted of conspiracy to commit murder and sentenced to 10 years in federal prison. It was a devastating blow. For decades, Raymond had operated with seeming freedom from punishment, avoiding serious prosecution despite his big role in organized crime. Now at age 60, he was facing significant prison time. The conviction sent shock waves through the underworld. If Raymond Patriarca could be brought down, no one was safe. The FBI's new tactics, extensive electronic surveillance, aggressive recruitment of informants, sophisticated conspiracy prosecutions, were working against even the most careful and disciplined mob bosses. Raymond reported to federal prison to start serving his sentence. For most criminals, prison is terrifying. Violence, hardship, loss of freedom. For Raymond, it was an inconvenience, but not a disaster. He had been in prison before during his youth, and he knew how to handle it. More importantly, his reputation and power reached behind the walls. Prison guards, many from working-class ethnic neighborhoods where the mob had influence, treated him with respect. Other inmates knew who he was and showed him deference. Raymond was able to keep control of his organization even from prison. Visitors came regularly, seemingly family and lawyers, but actually including key lieutenants bringing reports and getting instructions. Messages were smuggled in and out through corrupt guards and other inmates. Phone calls, though monitored, could pass information through code words. Henry Tamaleo and others in the leadership handled day-to-day operations, but big decisions still went through Raymond. The empire kept working, though maybe not quite as efficiently as when the boss was free and able to meet face-to-face with his helpers. Raymond's time in prison was made more comfortable through bribes and arrangements. He had access to better food than regular inmates, more visiting time, certain privileges that eased the hardship. It wasn't freedom, but it was bearable. More concerning than the immediate conditions was what this conviction meant. The government had figured out how to prosecute him successfully. They had broken through the protection that had shielded him for decades. And they were undoubtedly working on more cases, even as he served his sentence. The FBI's electronic surveillance of the office and other Patriarca family locations kept producing damaging intelligence. The bugs caught countless conversations about criminal activity, planning crimes, discussing murders, dividing profits, corrupting officials. One especially useful bug was put in Jerry Angelo's Boston headquarters. Angelo was less careful than Raymond about what he said and where he said it, and the FBI tapes caught him discussing the family's business in incredible detail. The recording showed the scope of the gambling operations, the methods used to enforce discipline, the corruption of police, and the relationships between the Patriarca family and other crime organizations. They were a prosecutor's dream, clear, direct evidence of ongoing criminal business. The FBI began building new cases based on this evidence. They identified targets for prosecution and developed strategies for using the tapes in court. They also used the intelligence to recruit informants, approaching family members and associates with evidence of their crimes and offering deals for cooperation. The pressure was mounting from all sides. The old ways of operating, relying on omerta, keeping the boss away from direct criminal activity, corrupting local police, were proving inadequate against federal prosecutors. Armed with electronic surveillance and conspiracy laws, Raymond's health began to decline during this period. He had always been relatively healthy, but the stress of legal troubles, combined with age and genetics, started taking a toll. He developed heart problems, experiencing chest pains and shortness of breath in prison. Adequate medical care was available, but not ideal. Raymond worried a serious health crisis behind bars could be fatal. His lawyers filed motions, seeking his release on medical grounds, arguing he needed treatment that couldn't be provided in prison. The government opposed these, arguing Raymond was exaggerating his health problems and had access to adequate care. But eventually, a combination of his declining health, his relatively good behavior in prison, and excellent legal help got him out early. In 1971. After serving only about 3 years of his 10-year sentence, Raymond Patriarca was released from federal prison. He was 63 years old, in poor health, and facing a very different landscape for organized crime. World Raymond returned to in 1971 was significantly different from the one he left in 1968. The FBI's war on organized crime had intensified dramatically. Electronic surveillance was now routine in major investigations. The government had gotten convictions against mob bosses across the country. The seemingly untouchable leaders of La Cosa, Nostra were being brought down one after another. The RICO Act, the Racketeer-Influenced and Corrupt Organizations Act had been passed in 1970, giving prosecutors a powerful new weapon. RICO let the government prosecute criminal businesses as organizations, making it possible to charge bosses for crimes committed by their helpers as part of an ongoing criminal conspiracy. It was designed specifically to fight organized crime, and it would prove devastatingly effective. The drug trade was also changing the criminal scene. Despite the mob's traditional ban on drug trafficking, the huge profits from heroin and cocaine were proving too tempting for many younger criminals. Independent drug dealers were operating in territory the mob had once controlled exclusively. Some family members were secretly getting into drugs despite the rules against it. Raymond also faced internal challenges. Some in the organization had gotten used to operating without his direct oversight during his prison years. There were questions about whether Raymond, now older and in poor health, could still command the authority he once had. Rivals sensed possible weakness, but Raymond hadn't survived 4 decades in the criminal underworld by being weak or indecisive. He moved quickly to reassert his control, meeting with key helpers, settling arguments, reminding everyone he was still the boss and his word was still law. In 1973, a murder happened that would create more legal problems for Raymond. William Marfeo, a bookmaker who worked in Providence, was shot dead in his car. Marfeo had apparently been operating without permission from the Patriarca family, refusing to pay tribute and defying Raymond's authority. The murder was done as a lesson. No one could operate in New England without Raymond's blessing. But it was also sloppy, done in a way that gave police significant evidence. Witnesses came forward. Ballistics evidence was collected. FBI surveillance picked up relevant conversations. Prosecutors began building a murder conspiracy case against Raymond and several of his helpers. Raymond had tried to keep himself separate from the murder, giving orders through middlemen and avoiding any direct involvement. But the conspiracy laws meant that if he had authorized the killing, he could be charged with murder even if he hadn't pulled the trigger himself. The legal battles over the Marfeo murder would drag on for years, using up time, money, and energy Raymond would have preferred to spend managing his organization. By the mid-1970s, Raymond operated knowing the FBI was likely listening to everything he said. The office had been permanently compromised. His home might be bugged. His cars might have tracking devices. His phone calls were certainly monitored. This constant surveillance forced big changes in how he did business. Sensitive conversations had to happen outdoors while walking, where bugs couldn't easily overhear. Code words and indirect references replaced direct language. Written records were avoided completely. The suspicion was justified, but exhausting. Raymond had to assume anyone could be an informant, any conversation could be recorded, any mistake could lead to prosecution. The mental burden of operating under such conditions was immense. He also had to deal with knowing the FBI knew more about his organization than he might know himself. They had tapes of conversations he'd forgotten. They had informants reporting on things he wasn't aware of. They were building cases he couldn't see coming. It was like playing poker against opponents who could see your cards. You might still win some hands through skill and experience, but the basic advantage was with the other side. Raymond's son, Raymond Jr., was now in his 30s and taking on more responsibility within the organization. The older Raymond was clearly preparing for a handover, wanting to make sure leadership of the family stayed in the family. But Raymond Jr.'s limitations were becoming more apparent. He lacked his father's strategic brilliance and commanding presence. He was capable with routine matters but struggled with complex problems. Some in the organization doubted he could hold the family together once his father was gone. There were also generational tensions. Raymond Jr. had grown up with wealth and privilege, not poverty and struggle like his father. He hadn't had to fight for every opportunity. Some of the older members felt he hadn't truly earned his position and wouldn't command the same respect. Raymond Sr. knew about these concerns but felt he had no choice. Passing leadership to someone outside the family would betray everything he'd built. He hoped Raymond Jr. would grow into the role. That experience would develop the qualities he currently lacked. It was a gamble, but Raymond Sr. had made bigger gambles in his life and won. He convinced himself this one would work out. 2. The 1970s brought technological changes that further complicated Raymond's operations. Electronic funds transfer made it harder to move cash undetected. Computer databases let police cross-reference information and spot patterns. Better forensic techniques made it easier to connect suspects to crimes. The old methods, cash transactions, face-to-face meetings, minimal paperwork were still used, but were becoming less sufficient. The FBI could now analyze phone records to map criminal networks. They could use computer databases to find connections between suspects. They could use sophisticated surveillance equipment, nearly impossible to detect. Raymond tried to adapt, but he was a man from an earlier time. He understood the new threats intellectually, but couldn't always change his instincts and habits. He'd spent decades operating a certain way, and changing those patterns was difficult. Younger criminals who had grown up with technology were better positioned to adapt, but they lacked Raymond's experience and wisdom. It was a generational shift happening across organized crime, creating tensions and opportunities alike. Throughout the 1970s, federal charges against Patriarca family members kept piling up. Jerry and Julo faced multiple prosecutions. Other capos and soldiers were arrested and charged with various crimes. Some went to trial and were convicted. Others pleaded guilty and accepted prison sentences. Each prosecution weakened the organization. Members who went to prison couldn't make money or manage operations. Legal fees used up money that might otherwise have been profit. And most dangerously, some of those facing long prison sentences chose to cooperate with the government rather than stay silent. The code of omerta, once seemingly absolute, was cracking. The sentences were too long, the evidence too strong, the pressure too great. Men who had sworn eternal loyalty to the family decided saving themselves was more important than protecting the organization. Raymond responded to defectors with fury. Anyone suspected of cooperating with police was marked for death. But even this ultimate punishment was losing its power to scare. The government's witness protection program could hide and protect cooperators, giving them new identities and moving them far from mob revenge. The old system was breaking down, and Raymond could see it happening but couldn't stop it. In his quieter moments, Raymond must have thought about the life he'd lived and the choices he'd made. He was now in his 70s, in declining health, facing ongoing legal battles, watching his empire slowly fall apart. Had it been worth it? The money, the power, the respect? Had they justified decades of crime, violence, constant fear, time in prison, the family members and associates destroyed? Raymond wasn't the type to publicly show regret or self-doubt, but he was smart enough to see the costs of his choices. He'd missed big parts of his children's lives because of his criminal activities. He'd sent men to their deaths. He'd hurt countless people through his gambling, loan sharking, and extortion operations. Yet, he'd also provided for his family, built something significant, and operated by a code of conduct that had meaning to him. In the twisted logic of the criminal world, he'd been one of the successful ones, a boss who had ruled for decades and died free rather than in prison. Whether that was success in any real sense was a question Raymond would have struggled to answer honestly. By 1980, the Patriarca crime family was a shadow of its former self. Federal prosecutions had devastated the leadership. Key members were in prison or facing charges. Income from traditional operations had dropped as police pressure made it harder to operate profitably. The gambling business, once the family's mainstay, was being hurt by state-run lotteries. Rhode Island and other New England states had legalized certain forms of gambling, undercutting the illegal operations that had made so much mob money. The loan sharking business continued, but faced competition from credit cards and other sources of consumer credit. The labor racketeering operations were under intense federal scrutiny after RICO prosecutions. Younger criminals were less interested in joining the traditional mob. The life looked much less attractive than it once had. Too much risk, too much police heat, too much chance of ending up dead or in prison. The new money was in drugs, and the Italian-American mob's refusal to get heavily into drug trafficking meant losing influence to Black, Hispanic, and Asian criminal organizations. Raymond watched this decline with frustration and acceptance. He'd built an empire, and now he was watching it crumble in his final years. But he was too old, too sick, and too legally vulnerable to turn things around. In 1981, Jerry Angiulo and several of his brothers were charged with racketeering, based largely on the FBI recordings from bugs in their Boston headquarters. The tapes caught them discussing murders, extortion, loan sharking, and other criminal activities in detail. The Angiulo prosecution was a major event. Jerry had been one of Raymond's most important and profitable helpers for decades. The Boston operation had made huge amounts of money and controlled important territory. Losing Angiulo would be a catastrophic blow to the family. Raymond knew there was little he could do. The evidence was overwhelming. Hours of tape recordings with Angiulo's own voice discussing crimes. The best lawyers money could buy might delay the inevitable, but conviction seemed certain. Angiulo went to trial in 1986 after Raymond's death and was convicted on multiple counts. He was sentenced to 45 years in federal prison, effectively a life sentence for a man in his 60s. The Boston crew was taken apart, its leadership imprisoned, its operations disrupted beyond repair. The Angiulo prosecution showed how effective the FBI's electronic surveillance strategy was. The bugs had caught exactly the kind of evidence prosecutors needed to prove RICO violations, multiple instances of criminal conduct, discussion of criminal business, orders from leadership to helpers. Raymond's heart condition got much worse in the early 1980s. He had multiple heart episodes that needed hospitalization. His doctors warned another serious heart attack could be fatal. The stress of his legal troubles and the collapse of his organization certainly didn't help his physical health. The constant worry, the anger at seeing decades of work destroyed, the fear of spending his final years in prison, all this took a toll. Raymond cut back on his activities, spending more time at home and less time at what remained of his operations. He relied more on helpers to handle routine matters, saving his energy for the most important decisions. He looked frail, a dramatic change from the strong man who had ruled New England for so many years. Those who saw him during this time were often shocked at his appearance. Thin, pale, moving slowly, looking every bit his age and more, but his mind stayed sharp. In meetings, he still showed the strategic thinking and perceptiveness that had made him such an effective boss. He might be physically diminished, but intellectually, he remained impressive. Knowing his time was limited, Raymond spent more time with family in these final years. Helen, his wife of more than 50 years, cared for him as his health declined. She'd stood by him through decades of criminal activity, multiple imprisonments, and constant legal troubles. Whatever one thinks of her husband's life choices, her loyalty was absolute. Raymond's children and grandchildren visited regularly. Raymond tried to be a grandfather in the normal sense, taking interest in his grandchildren's lives, offering advice, giving financial support. He wanted to be remembered as a family man, not just a gangster. But the separation between his two lives was never complete. His children and grandchildren knew what he'd done and what the family business truly was. They'd grown up knowing their father and grandfather was one of America's most powerful criminals. They'd enjoyed the benefits of his illegal income, while also carrying the stain of the family name. Raymond Jr. was still involved in the organization, though his role shrank as the family's operations declined. Raymond Sr. had to accept that his son would never be the boss he himself had been, and that the organization might not survive long after his death. Even in his final years, Raymond faced ongoing legal troubles. Prosecutors kept investigating him for various crimes. Grand juries heard testimony about his criminal activities. The possibility of new charges hung over him constantly. His lawyers worked tirelessly to keep him out of prison, arguing his age and health made jail inappropriate, that he was no longer actively involved in crime, that prosecution would serve no useful purpose at this stage of his life. Some of these arguments worked, at least in delaying prosecutions. But Raymond knew if prosecutors built a strong enough case and got an indictment, his age and health might not be enough to avoid conviction and prison. The legal bills were enormous. Defending against federal prosecution needed expensive lawyers with expertise in organized crime law. Even with his wealth, the constant legal battles used up resources at an alarming rate. As Raymond faced the end of his life, he thought about the legacy he would leave. He'd been one of the most powerful mob bosses in American history, ruling New England for 3 decades. But what would that mean in the larger scope of history? He'd lived by a code omerta, loyalty, respect. But that code was breaking down, unable to withstand modern police, techniques, and the self-interest of criminals. Facing long prison sentences, he'd built an organization that at its peak employed hundreds and made tens of millions of dollars every year. But that organization was crumbling, likely to collapse completely once he was gone. He'd provided for his family, making sure they had wealth and comfort. But he'd also burdened them with a criminal legacy that would follow them for generations. He'd commanded respect and fear from everyone who knew him. But what good was that respect once you were dead? These were heavy thoughts for a dying man. Raymond wasn't prone to sentimentality or public shows of regret, but in private, he must have wrestled with the meaning of the life he'd lived and the choices he'd made. In 1984, Raymond was 76 years old and clearly failing. He spent most of his time at home, seeing only family and his closest associates. The office, once the nerve center of his empire, was mostly inactive. The organization kept operating at a much reduced level. But Raymond was no longer actively managing it. He received visitors who came to pay their respects, old associates remembering better times, younger family members seeking his blessing or advice, people from the neighborhood wanting to see the legendary boss one more time. Raymond kept his dignity even in decline. He dressed carefully for visitors, received them politely, listened to their concerns, offered what wisdom he still could. He wanted to be remembered as a boss until the end, not as a sick old man. His doctors watched his heart condition closely. Multiple medications helped manage his symptoms, but everyone knew another serious heart event was likely and could come any time. Raymond refused to go to the hospital unless absolutely necessary. He wanted to spend his final days at home, surrounded by family, not in a sterile medical facility. Helen was with him constantly in these final months. After more than 5 decades of marriage, Much of it lived in the shadow of his criminal empire. She remained devoted. She managed his medications, worked with his doctors, protected him from visitors who might tire him too much. Raymond Jr. came often, still seeking his father's guidance on family business. The older Raymond offered what advice he could, though he knew the organization's future was bleak. He advised his son to be careful, to avoid unnecessary risks, to think about whether it might be time to step away from the life completely. But Raymond knew his son wouldn't take that advice. The life had its hooks in Raymond Jr., just as it had hooked Raymond himself so many decades earlier. The money, the power, the respect, the excitement, once you experience them. Walking away is almost impossible. On July 11, 1984, Raymond Patriarca had a massive heart attack at his Providence home. Helen called an ambulance immediately, but there was nothing to be done. Raymond died before the paramedics arrived. He was 76 years old. He died in his own bed, a free man surrounded by the life he built. For a mob boss of his era, it was about as good an ending as one could hope for. The news spread quickly through the underworld. Raymond Patriarca, the boss of New England for nearly 30 years, was dead. It marked the end of an era in organized crime. Police officials who had spent decades trying to bring him down felt a mix of satisfaction and frustration. They'd gotten some convictions, but Raymond had never spent much time in prison. He died wealthy and free, which seemed like getting away with it in the end. His associates and family members felt real grief. Whatever else he'd been, Raymond had been loyal to those who were loyal to him. He'd taken care of people, settled their arguments fairly, ruled with a consistency that gave order to the chaotic world of organized crime. Raymond's funeral was held at Holy Ghost Church on Federal Hill, the same church where he'd been baptized as a baby 76 years earlier. The circle was complete. He'd begun and ended in the neighborhood that shaped him. The funeral was a major event. Hundreds attended, including family, friends, real businessmen, politicians, and of course, mobsters from across the country. The FBI photographed everyone who attended, documenting the gathering of organized crime figures for their files. The ceremony was traditional Catholic, the same rituals that had marked life in the Italian immigrant community for generations. Prayers in Latin and Italian, incense, a eulogy that spoke of Raymond as a devoted family man and successful businessman, carefully avoiding any mention of his criminal career. After the church service, a long line of cars followed the hearse to the cemetery. Raymond was buried in a plot he'd bought years earlier, with a substantial but not showy headstone. Even in death, he kept a certain restraint and dignity. As the casket was lowered and the priest gave the final blessing, those there knew they were witnessing the end of an era. The old-school mob boss, who'd ruled through intelligence and discipline, who'd built and kept an empire for 3 decades, who represented a particular kind of organized crime. That era was over. Raymond Jr. officially became boss of the Patriarca crime family after his father's death. He'd been prepared for the position and had the legitimacy of bloodline, but everyone in the organization knew he wasn't the leader his father had been. The family was already weakened by years of federal prosecution and the changing landscape of organized crime. Raymond Jr. lacked the authority to hold things together. Internal arguments that the older Raymond would have solved quickly and decisively festered under his less capable leadership. The Boston crew, already wrecked by the Angelo prosecution, became more independent. Other factions within the family began operating with little coordination. The tight, disciplined organization Raymond Sr. had built started to break apart. Raymond Jr. tried to assert control, but he faced challenges from many directions. Other mob families saw weakness and moved into traditional Patriarca territory. Federal prosecutors kept building cases and getting convictions against family members. And internal disagreement grew as ambitious members questioned why they should follow someone they saw as an inadequate leader. The empire Raymond had built over 30 years began to collapse almost immediately after his death. It had been held together by the force of his personality and the respect he commanded. Without him, it couldn't sustain itself. The years right after Raymond Patriarca's death saw the rapid dismantling of the organization he built. Federal prosecutors, armed with RICO laws and increasingly sophisticated investigative techniques, targeted the family aggressively. In 1986, as mentioned, Jerry Angiulo and his brothers were convicted and sentenced to long prison terms. The Boston operation, one of the family's most profitable parts, was effectively destroyed. Throughout the late 1980s and early 1990s, more prosecutions followed. Capos, soldiers, and associates were charged, tried, and convicted. Some went to prison keeping omerta. Others chose to cooperate with the government, giving testimony against their former associates. The code of silence Raymond had enforced so strictly was completely breaking down. Members facing decades in prison made practical calculations that their loyalty to a crumbling organization was worth less than their freedom. The FBI's Witness Protection Program offered a real alternative to both prison and death. Cooperate, testify, and get a new identity and relocation far from mob revenge. Each cooperating witness gave information that led to more prosecutions, which produced more cooperating witnesses, a destructive cycle the family couldn't stop. The organization was being destroyed from within and without at the same time. Raymond Patriarca Jr. proved to be exactly the inadequate leader some had feared. He lacked his father's strategic vision, his ability to command loyalty, his skill at avoiding prosecution. In 1990, Raymond Jr. was charged with racketeering. The prosecution presented evidence he'd continued his father's criminal operations, overseeing gambling, loan sharking, and extortion. But unlike his father, who had successfully avoided serious convictions for most of his career, Raymond Jr. was convicted relatively quickly. He was sentenced to 8 years in federal prison. While he was locked up, whatever control he'd kept over the family vanished completely. Other members pursued their own interests without coordination. The family existed in name, but barely functioned as an organization. Raymond Jr. was released in 1998 after serving his sentence. He tried to reassert control, but found the family had become a shell of its former self. Most of the capable members were dead, imprisoned, or had moved to other activities. The profit centers that had supported the organization were gone. In 2011, Raymond Jr. died of natural causes, never having restored the family to anything like its former power. The Patriarca dynasty that had seemed so strong during Raymond Sr.'s era had lasted barely a generation beyond his death. One of the most damaging revelations after Raymond's death involved the FBI's use of informants during his era. It turned out the FBI had knowingly let innocent people be convicted of murders that FBI informants had actually committed, or that the informants knew the real killers. The most famous case involved the murder of Edward Teddy Deegan in 1965, mentioned earlier. 4 men were convicted of the murder, partly based on testimony from an FBI informant named Joseph the Animal Barboza. But the FBI knew Barboza was lying and that one of the convicted men, Joseph Salvati, was innocent. The FBI protected Barboza because he was giving valuable information about the Patriarca family and other organized crime groups. They considered Barboza's intelligence more important than making sure innocent people weren't convicted of murder. Salvati spent 30 years in prison for a murder he didn't commit before being cleared. He and other victims of this FBI misconduct eventually sued the federal government and won large settlements, totaling over $100 million. These revelations tarnished the FBI's victory over the Patriarca family. Yes, they'd successfully taken apart a major criminal organization, but they'd done so using tactics that were themselves criminal and unconstitutional. They'd encouraged perjury, hidden evidence that could prove innocence, and let innocent people be imprisoned. The scandal raised hard questions about the proper limits of police tactics. How much misconduct is acceptable when going after dangerous criminals? Can the end ever truly justify such means? Today, the Patriarca crime family still technically exists, but is a fraction of its former self. It's estimated to have maybe 24 made members and associates, compared to hundreds during Raymond's era. The family still does some traditional mob activities, small-scale gambling, loan sharking, some extortion, but the massive, sophisticated operations that once made tens of millions of dollars every year are long gone. Several factors explain this decline. Beyond just federal prosecution, the legalization of gambling in many forms has eliminated much of the market for illegal gambling. State lotteries, casino gambling in Connecticut and Rhode Island, online betting, and sports betting have made the mob's gambling operations mostly obsolete. Alternative sources of credit have reduced demand for loan sharking. While loan sharks still operate, the market is much smaller than it once was. Labor unions have declined in power and membership, making labor racketeering less profitable. Law enforcement has kept constant pressure, making it hard for the family to rebuild or expand. The mystique of La Cosa Nostra has faded. Younger criminals don't see joining the Italian-American mob as an attractive or profitable career when other opportunities exist. Where does Raymond Patriarca rank among the great American mob bosses? It's a question organized crime historians and fans debate. In terms of longevity, Raymond is near the top. His effective rule over New England lasted from roughly the late 1940s until his death in 1984, about 35 years. Very few bosses kept power that long without being killed or imprisoned for long periods. In terms of power, Raymond controlled 6 states with little interference from other families. He had a seat on the commission, showing he was recognized as an equal by the most powerful mob bosses in the country. In terms of business sense, Raymond was exceptional. He ran his criminal empire like a company, with clear ranks, defined territories, systematic revenue collection, and strategic planning. He diversified his income and kept real business fronts that provided cover for illegal activities. In terms of violence, Raymond was neither the most brutal nor the most restrained of mob bosses. He used violence when needed but preferred negotiation and compromise when possible. He killed to remove threats and maintain discipline, not randomly. In terms of fame, Raymond was less famous than bosses like Al Capone, Lucky Luciano, John Gotti, or even Carlo Gambino. He deliberately avoided the spotlight, which helped him stay in power longer, but meant he never got the name recognition of some of his contemporaries. Most organized crime experts would rank Raymond Patriarca among the top tier of American mob bosses. Not quite at the level of the New York bosses who controlled the nation's largest city, but certainly among the most successful regional bosses in American history. Unlike some mob bosses who became pop culture icons, Raymond Patriarca stayed relatively unknown to the general public during his lifetime and after. There have been no major Hollywood films about him, no TV series focused on his life. However, he has appeared in various books about organized crime. The most detailed treatment was in *The Underboss: The Rise and Fall of a Mafia, Family * by journalists Dick Lear and Gerard O'Neill, which looks at the Patriarca family's history and decline. Raymond is also mentioned in many FBI documents released under Freedom of Information Act requests. These documents show the extensive surveillance and investigation of his activities over decades. In Providence and Boston, Raymond remains a legendary figure in local folklore about organized crime. Old-timers still tell stories about his era, often with a mix of fear and admiration. The office on 812 Avenue is now a different business. But people who know the neighborhood's history still point it out as the place where Raymond once ruled New England. The romanticizing of mob history has meant some people see Raymond as a kind of anti-hero. The immigrant son who refused to accept poverty and discrimination, who built an empire through intelligence and determination. This view conveniently ignores the violence, corruption, and human suffering his empire caused. What can we learn from Raymond Patriarca's life and criminal career? First, intelligence and discipline can take you far. Even in illegal businesses, Raymond's success wasn't based mainly on physical intimidation or reckless violence. It was based on strategic thinking, careful planning, and systematic organization. He thought long-term when many criminals focused only on immediate gains. Second, discretion is valuable. Raymond's deliberate avoidance of publicity and showy displays helped him keep power much longer than bosses who sought attention. He understood real power doesn't need to advertise itself. Third, loyalty is a double-edged sword. Raymond's demand for absolute loyalty from his helpers helped maintain discipline and unity. But it also meant when the FBI found ways to break that loyalty through informants and cooperating witnesses, the whole organization became vulnerable. Fourth, adaptation is essential but difficult. Raymond built his empire using the tools and techniques available in the mid-20th century. When technology and police tactics evolved, he struggled to adapt. Organizations that can't evolve eventually fail. Fifth, succession planning is crucial. Raymond's decision to pass leadership to his son, based on bloodline rather than ability, was a critical mistake that sped up the organization's collapse. Choosing leaders based on family ties rather than merit rarely works well in any organization, legal or criminal. Sixth, and most importantly, crime doesn't pay in the long run. Yes, Raymond became wealthy and powerful, but he spent years in prison, lived under constant threat of violence and prosecution, died knowing his empire was crumbling, and left a legacy that brought shame and legal trouble to his family. The human cost of his criminal career measured in ruined lives, destroyed families, communities damaged by the operations he controlled, was enormous. It's important to remember that behind the fascination with mob history are real victims. The Patriarca crime family's operations destroyed countless lives. Gambling addicts who lost everything betting with the family's bookmakers, leaving their families with nothing. Small business owners who paid protection money for years, the extortion eating into their profits and sometimes forcing them to close. Borrowers crushed by loan shark debt, forced to commit crimes themselves or lose everything they owned. Workers whose unions were corrupted by mob influence, their pension funds stolen, their interests put behind criminal profit, murder victims and their families' lives ended. Families destroyed because someone was a threat to the organization or had information that needed silencing. Communities harmed by organized crime's presence, where corruption undermined real government and created cultures of cynicism and lawlessness. The money that flowed through Raymond's organization represented human suffering. Every dollar had a story, a family's savings bet and lost, a business owner's profits taken by extortion, a borrower's wages seized to pay extremely high interest. Raymond Patriarca was a criminal who built his fortune on this suffering. That reality should never be forgotten or romanticized. No matter how fascinating his organizational skills or how impressive his longevity as a mob boss, Henry Tamaleo, Raymond's underboss, was convicted on murder charges in 1968 along with Raymond. He died in prison in 1985, never released. He kept omerta to the end, refusing to cooperate with authorities despite spending his final years behind bars. Jerry Angulo, the Boston capo, was convicted in 1986 and sentenced to 45 years. He died in federal prison in 2009 at age 90. Despite pressure, he never cooperated with authorities. Raymond Patriarca Jr. served his prison sentence and was released in 1998. He lived quietly until his death in 2011, never restoring the family to its former power. Helen Patriarca, Raymond's wife, outlived him by many years, keeping the family home in Providence until her death. She never spoke publicly about her husband's criminal activities. Many other members and associates were convicted, served prison time, and either died in prison or lived their final years in reduced circumstances. A few successfully moved to real businesses. Some disappeared into the witness protection program after cooperating with authorities. The FBI ultimately achieved its goal of taking apart the Patriarca crime family through persistent investigation, sophisticated surveillance, aggressive prosecution, and the cultivation of informants. They broke an organization that had seemed untouchable, but the victory came with significant costs and complications. The use of informants like Joseph Barboza led to innocent people being convicted, a miscarriage of justice not corrected for decades. The extensive electronic surveillance raised civil liberties concerns that continue in debates about privacy and police powers. The focus on traditional Italian-American organized crime may have let other criminal organizations, drug cartels, street gangs, cybercriminals grow with less police attention. The romanticizing of the FBI's mob-fighting efforts sometimes hid the fact their tactics weren't always legal or ethical. Still, the dismantling of the Patriarca family and other traditional mob organizations was a significant law enforcement achievement. Organizations that had operated with relative freedom from punishment for decades were successfully prosecuted and taken apart. The power of La Cosa Nostra was broken, at least in its traditional form. The decline of traditional Italian-American organized crime didn't mean the end of organized criminal activity. New organizations emerged to fill the void. Drug trafficking organizations, mainly from Mexico and Colombia, built enormous empires based on cocaine, heroin, and later methamphetamine and fentanyl. Street gangs evolved into sophisticated criminal businesses, especially in the drug trade. Russian and Eastern European organized crime groups established footholds in American cities. Asian organized crime, including Chinese triads and Japanese yakuza, operated in immigrant communities. Cybercriminals, based anywhere in the world, could target American victims through the internet. These new forms of organized crime are in many ways more challenging for police than the traditional mob. They're more decentralized, more international, more technologically sophisticated, and less bound by the codes and structures that made La Cosa Nostra penetrable once investigators understood how it worked. The world Raymond Patriarca knew where organized crime meant. Italian-American families controlling traditional vice operations in defined geographic territories is largely gone. Crime has globalized and diversified, just like real business. Raymond Loretto Salvatore Patriarca lived 76 years. From 1908 to 1984, he saw extraordinary changes in American society, from the waves of Italian immigration in his childhood through Prohibition, the Great Depression, World War II, the post-war boom, the social upheavals of the 1960s and 1970s, to the beginning of the Reagan era. He built a criminal empire from almost nothing, rising from a poor immigrant neighborhood to control organized crime across 6 states. He showed exceptional intelligence, strategic thinking, and organizational ability. He kept power longer than most mob bosses managed, but he was also a criminal who built his wealth on human suffering. He ordered murders. He corrupted public officials. He ran operations that destroyed families and damaged communities. His empire was built on exploitation, violence, and fear. He died wealthy and free, having avoided the ultimate mob fate of being killed by rivals or dying in prison. In that sense, he won the game he chose to play. But the organization he built collapsed almost immediately after his death, and his legacy is one of crime and corruption. not real achievement. Was Raymond Patriarca a brilliant strategist who should be studied for his organizational and leadership skills? Yes. Was he also a criminal whose life's work caused immense harm? Also yes. Both things can be true at the same time. His story is fascinating as history and as a case study in how illegal organizations function. But it should also serve as a warning about the ultimate pointlessness of a criminal life. Raymond achieved wealth and power, but at enormous cost to others and to himself. He could have used his considerable abilities in legal pursuits, and perhaps achieved even greater success without the violence. Prison time, constant legal danger, and moral weight of a criminal career. When Raymond Patriarca died on July 11, 1984. An era of American organized crime died with him. The old-school mob boss who ruled through discipline and intelligence, who kept the traditions of La Cosa Nostra, who exercised near absolute control over a defined territory. That model was already becoming outdated. The FBI's new tactics, the power of RICO prosecutions, the breaking of omerta through witness protection and informant cultivation, the changing economics of vice operations, all these factors meant organized crime couldn't keep functioning as it had during Raymond's peak. The romantic image of the mafia, the men of honor living by a code, the families bound by loyalty and tradition, was shown to be largely myth. When faced with decades in prison, most members chose self-preservation over loyalty. The code broke down because it was based on fear and self-interest, not genuine honor. Raymond Patriarca was among the last of a dying breed. The mob bosses who came after him either ended up in prison quickly or never achieved the kind of power and control Raymond had. The golden age of La Cosa Nostra was over. Today, the name Patriarca is mainly of interest to organized crime historians, true crime fans, and people in New England who remember or have heard stories about the era when Raymond ruled the region's underworld. The office on Otwell's Avenue is now a different business. Federal Hill is known for its restaurants and festivals, not for mob activity. The New England underworld Raymond, once controlled, has been transformed beyond recognition. Time and law enforcement did what Raymond's enemies never could. They ended his empire and his legacy. The Silent Dawn of New England is now just a chapter in history. Books a reminder of an era when organized crime functioned differently than it does today. Raymond Patriarca ruled New England's underworld for 3 decades from a modest vending machine shop on Federal Hill. He proved real power doesn't need to be loud. It just needs to be absolute. Through intelligence, discipline, and strategic thinking, he built a criminal empire that controlled 6 states and made tens of millions of dollars every year. But his story also shows us both the appeal and the ultimate pointlessness of a life in organized crime. He had wealth, power, and respect within his world. People feared and obeyed him. He provided for his family and lived better than the poverty of his childhood could have predicted. Yet he spent years in prison. He lived under constant threat of violence and prosecution. He ordered murders and ran operations that destroyed lives. He died watching his empire crumble and knowing his legacy was one of crime, not real achievement. The organization he'd spent decades building collapsed within years of his death. Raymond Patriarca's life was extraordinary in its scope and impact, but it was also a warning about the costs and consequences of choosing a criminal path, no matter how intelligent or disciplined one might be in pursuing it. If you made it this far, you're a true crime legend. Leave a comment letting me know what surprised you most about Raymond Patriarca's story. Should I cover more New England mob history? What gangster should I cover next? Let me know below. Don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. Hit the like button if you enjoyed this story and share it with anyone who loves true crime and mob history. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next story. Sleep well or keep watching.